Live from Chicago, Illinois, from the studios of the Kennedy King College. Truth and Logic.
Good morning, everybody. You have David Cross, along with Deron Montgomery, Michelle Daniels, and also a special guest, Dr. Davis. And we will be talking about the state of the black community and can it be fixed? So, Dr. Davis, with all the crime going on inside the city of Chicago, you hear police chief saying the violence is down, but when you turn on the news, all you see is violence. And I think it's a shame. I think it's quite embarrassing when we can say that we had 36 hours of no shootings. I mean, I just like to know, what is your take on that?
Violence may be down statistically, right? But when the number and the bar was set so high to begin with, that's not really saying much. But it's a fine line. In class, we often talk about the news media and how it can hype people up. It can have they have agendas. They can make the community fearful every time they step out of the house, but also it's necessary in some ways to keep you informed, of course. Yes, this obviously a crime epidemic in Chicago. What can we do about it? I believe that we need to be more self-reliant. We need to put more emphasis on helping each other in our or organizing within our community, controlling our own blocks and whatnot, and put less emphasis on policing, right? I think that's where it could start. But ultimately, on a larger level, it's about employment, man. There's this old saying that says it's poverty, stupid. When people are poor, when they don't have opportunities, you're going to see all these other things. So everything else is just bandages for issues that require surgery.
What do you feel about when people say, well, voting is going to make the change for black people? What do you feel like that stands in this point? Do you feel like voting is an important part to the community and the violence in the community, and you think that it would help, or do you think it would still hinder?
That's a great question, and I'm conflicted. The great philosopher Nasir Jones, also known as Nas, when he talked about voting, he said, who you going to elect, Satan or Satan, right? Oftentimes that's the position that we're in, but at the same time, things in the community, whether it's mental health, funding, and other things, those are political issues. So you need people in office that can make those decisions or that are looking out for the community, so you have to be active, right? But I understand the disenchantment most of our community, or not most, a lot of our community has with the voting process because it's so full of corruption and nonsense. But at the same time, you must remain active.
Kind of piggyback off of what Michelle asked as far as voting and the community and the structure within the community, right? We just had an election, and you have a lot of people in the community that say that their vote doesn't count. They don't feel like their vote counts because of the electoral process. So I don't know if you want to break down how the electoral process works, but on a smaller scale, we spend so much time looking at president, governor, mayor, et cetera, but the same people that say that their vote don't matter, they want prison reform. Right. Well, you need to vote for judges and district attorneys, et cetera, et cetera. So would you speak to that and basically how that can affect the community?
So I believe that lower level, if you will, elections are more important. That's my stance on it. But at the same time, we often go vote and do our civic duty, but we don't recognize the names of these judges. We don't know what they stand for. We don't know who they are. So we're just voting Democrat a lot of the times in our community. And that's not necessarily the smart thing to do, right? So because of our history, more recent history of not being active and not holding politicians accountable, we don't know who we're putting or who's there. Dr. Boyce Watkins, he's a kind of a controversial what's the word I'm looking for? I guess you could say social critic. He's an academic, but he's no longer practicing in academia. But he posted something. He said, this year, I voted for every candidate that was solely for black issues. And that was his way of saying he didn't vote at all. Because there was no candidates speaking to black issues, right? So it's this weird position that we're in where you just have to vote for the lesser of an evil, even on a local level. But that's better than nothing, but it's not very encouraging when that's the best you could hope for.
You have people vote Democrat just because they're Democrat. People vote Republican just because they're Republican. And in Nevada, Dennis Hoff who is the owner of the Bunny Ranch, passed away. Former owner of the Bunny Ranch passed away October 16th, and he won the election. I mean, so that just shows you that people were just voting Republican just because they're Republican. So that's the issue with me.
People also vote for names they recognize, right? So he was a popular name. He was.
The movie Distinguished Gentleman.
It's that's all it is. The name they know. And another thing I meant to mention too, while a lot of us in the community are kind of adverse to voting, is voter suppression, right? We're seeing all these stories coming out about these slick tactics that they're using, they meaning the powers that be or whoever, to suppress a lot of the African American vote. So that's another reason why we're so discouraged, many of us, to get out there, right? So it's hard for someone like me who considers themselves like an educator activist to tell people to get out there and vote, because I believe in that. But I'm so hurt, I guess you could say, right, by the way the process really works. So it's always a difficult topic for me to talk about.
If there was a vote for Dancing with the Stars or American Next Top Model, and they had to go through the same things, people would go out there and vote. So why is it such a big issue to go out there and vote for somebody that can control your community?
Because if you vote for Jerry Rice, he might win. Like your vote might directly impact the results, and many of us feel that our vote won't directly impact the result that we're hoping for. So you're right, and that's why it is important to voice your opinion. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done with how this process works, and so I'm sensitive to people's resistance to voting. I am, but in spite of that, I still encourage people to go out and vote for the issues that you mentioned on a local level. Mental health, education funding, different things that will make it convenient for corporations to come here and open jobs in communities, right? These are all political issues. So this is the stuff that we're crying about. Gun reform, like all these things that we're crying about every day, those are political issues. So it's no way to fix this without having some political action. Now, let me say this though, while I believe in the political realm, I think that it's foolish for African Americans in particular to depend on politics, right? Because we have a long, or a lot of data to show us that doesn't necessarily work for us all the time. It's ultimately up to us to create change among us, right? So we have to be self-reliant and stop depending on any outside force.
Do you feel like economics within the black community is very important and detrimental to us going beyond where we are right now?
Yes, you read my mind, right? The African Americans, I think the last I read, it was like we have $1.4 trillion in the black community alone. They say we're like one of the top 10 richest countries in the world. If African Americans were a nation, we'd be like a top 10 nation. So this goes back to my point. We have all the resources at this point. W.E.B. Du Bois, depending on how you feel today, the talented 10 theory that he talked about 100 years ago, we have that now. I have a thing I say, how can you, if you don't define victory, how can you ever win? Right? I feel like we haven't defined victory. We have the victory at this point. We're just not recognizing it. So to your point about economics, we can do anything we want within the community. We have that. We just have to galvanize. We have to get the resources together and responsibly allocate funds to have our missions accomplished. And that's what we're not doing. But we're depending on governors and all this other stuff and people that have a long history of saying we don't care about what you have going on. That's foolish.
Okay, well, first, as far as voter suppression is concerned, and I just learned this last week, there's a provision, and I believe it's the 6th Amendment. I'm not, like I said, I just learned this last week. But when you suppress votes, you have to suppress the same amount of votes on the other side, right? But you have politicians and lawyers who don't tell us this, right? Okay, so, but that's just to address that. What I wanted to talk about is that we talk about the black agenda, right? One of the biggest things when Obama was in office where people was like, what did he do for black people? Okay, that's really not the question. The question should be, what did we ask him to do? Because we never come to the table with an agenda, right? So, I mean, they're politicians, they're not mind readers. We need to come to the table with an agenda, and then when they don't adhere to that agenda, then we need to hold them accountable for that.
We could talk more another time, but one of the issues, or a major issue now, is how can we ever ask another president, at least in the near future, to do anything for black people or get mad at them for not? To your point, when we had a black man president in office for 8 years, and we didn't ask him anything. We didn't formally request anything. And I want to say this, we're going beyond the United States. We're in the decade of African descent. Lord, what's the name of the organization? The United Nations has dedicated from 2015 to 2024 as the decade of African descent, which means they have allocated funds and committees to address African American or African issues. And we're not even taking advantage of that. This is going beyond the U.S. government. And I've been saying this on every platform I've been on for the last 3 years, trying to get people to look into this. This is a real thing. Google it. Which camera are we in? Google this, right? That we are in the International Decade of African Descent, and we can make proposals and send this to the United Nations. The United Nations is already calling the USA out on violations or human rights violations against black people. So we have support outside of the border, and we're not utilizing this. So that's another thing we need to look into. Beyond just the presidency and the Oval Office, we can go to the United Nations with these concerns and try to get some support, and they're willing to help.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Thank you, sir.
Next time we have showcase, I'll make sure you well
Let me know.
prepared.
Let me know, man. This is good. This is a good thing you're doing.